Good evening and welcome to Indiana University Cinema's virtual screening room for And Then They Came for Us. This introduction and the following Q&A will all feature live captioning. To turn on captions, move your mouse to the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, click on Live Transcript, then click Show Subtitle. If you have any issues, please feel free to ask a question using the Q&A box, which you can reach by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. To begin tonight's program, IU Cinema wishes to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University is built upon Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Mi'kmaq, the Lenape, the Bodowadmik, and the Sawanwa peoples as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. We ask you to reflect on the lives and the histories of the Indigenous communities from wherever you are watching tonight. My name is Jessica Davis-Tagg. I'm the Events and Operations Director at IU Cinema. On behalf of the entire IU Cinema team, we'd like to thank you for being here for tonight's screening of And Then They Came for Us, which will then be followed by an interactive Q&A with our panel. To introduce the film tonight, we are joined by Caitlin Wu. Caitlin is a freshman at IU from Louisville, Kentucky, majoring in neuroscience and minoring in public health and global health. She currently works at the Asian Culture Center at IUB as a student assistant and serves as a freshman representative for the Asian American Association on campus. She also works as a research assistant at the NICE lab in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences with interests in healthcare equity, social identities, and stereotype threat, with a goal to attend medical school in the future. Welcome, Caitlin.
Hi, thank you so much, Jessica, for the introduction. My name is Caitlin Wu, and as Jessica said, I work as a student assistant at the Asian Culture Center on campus, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to today's event. I'm so glad that you could join us. On behalf of the ACC and IU Cinema, I now have the pleasure of introducing the film And Then They Came for Us. This film tells the story of the 120,000 Japanese Americans who were incarcerated in prison camps during World War II after President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in 1942, ordering all Americans who held at least 1/16 Japanese heritage to leave everything they knew behind. The film features Japanese American actor George Takei and numerous others who were sent to prison camps across the US, having never committed a crime except having the face of the enemy. This was said by Satsuki Ina, who was born in the maximum security Tule Lake concentration camp, and is one of today's panelists, along with the director and producer of the film, Abby Ginzberg. Dr. Ina, along with the photographs of Dorothea Lange and others, helped guide us through the pain of so many Japanese Americans of the time, but also help us to see the link to today's world as we see Muslim registries and bans come into effect in the United States. The power of the testimonies and photographs holds throughout the film, as we learn about the intense racism towards Japanese Americans as the country experiences yellow peril, or the perceived threat of Asians to Western civilization like never before. I hope that the film helps to shed some light on how history is repeating itself and the power of standing in solidarity with groups that are suffering. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to hand it back over to Jessica for some instructions, and I hope you all enjoy.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, for that introduction. Please come back if you can for the conversation and Q&A with filmmaker Abby Ginzberg and documentary subjects Satsuki Ina after the film. After the introduction, you will see the link to the film on your screen. Please note the film program will not screen through this Zoom webinar. You will need to open a web browser to watch the film using the website provided. See you after the film, and again, thank you for joining us. Welcome back to IU Cinema's virtual screening room and our Q&A about the movie And Then They Came for Us. I'd like to remind you that this Q&A will feature live captioning. To turn on captions, move your mouse to the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, click on Live Transcript, then click Show Subtitle. We will start the Q&A with a conversation between our guests, and about 20 minutes in, we will start answering audience questions. Please feel free to begin typing questions into the Q&A box at any time, which you can reach by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The moderator for tonight's panel is Eric Lengowski. Eric worked with the Asian Culture Center during his time at Indiana University, graduated in 2018, and currently serves as the Midwest District Governor of the Japanese American Citizens League. His work, Education Denied, Indiana University's Japanese American Ban 1942 to 1945, published in the Indiana Magazine of History, helped energize a movement to push Indiana University to formally apologize for banning Japanese American students during World War II. This movement led IU to issue an apology, memorial dedication, and scholarship program in July 2020. Please welcome Eric Lengowski.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jessica, for the introduction. And I want to thank everyone here for gathering on our Day of Remembrance commemoration here at Indiana University. I think it's very important that we do this in Indiana, and we continue to commemorate what happened during World War II. So I want to introduce our two honored guests from tonight. So we have Abby Ginzberg. Abby is a Peabody Award-winning director who has been producing compelling documentaries about race and social justice for over 30 years. Her film, And Then They Came for Us, won a Silver Gavel Award for Best Documentary from the American Bar Association, and is played in major cities at film festivals across the country and in Japan. Her most recent film, Barbara Lee, Speaking Truth to Power, is currently streaming on Amazon Prime and Starz, and has been nominated for an NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Documentary. It is a portrait of Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who is the highest-ranking African-American woman in Congress. Her film, Waging Change, is about the tipped minimum wage, which is still an abysmal $2.13 per hour in 17 states, including Indiana. The film focuses on restaurant workers who are forced to live off their tips to feed themselves and their families, and it is available on iTunes and Google Play. She also was the consulting producer on the Oscar-nominated short documentary, The Barber of Birmingham. She is currently the president of the Berkeley Film Foundation, which has funded over 170 films during the last 12 years. Let's welcome Abby.
Nice to be here.
Great. And I also want to introduce our other honored guest, Dr. Satsuki Ina. Dr. Ina is Professor Emeritus in the School of Education at California State University, Sacramento. Born in the maximum security Tule Lake Segregation Center, an American concentration camp during World War II, she currently continues her psychotherapy and consultation practice in Oakland, California, addressing issues of community and historical trauma. She has produced 2 award-winning documentary films about the World War II incarceration of Japanese American, Children of the Camps, and From a Silk Cocoon. Both documentaries have been broadcast nationally on PBS. A community activist, educator, and spokesperson, she is a co-organizer of Sudo for Solidarity, a grassroots nonviolent direct action project of Japanese American social justice advocates working to end today's child detention sites and to support frontline immigrants and refugee communities that are being targeted by racist, inhumane immigration policies. Let's also welcome Satsuki.
Thank you, Eric.
All right, so we all just watched And Then They Came for Us. It's a very powerful film. It's been a really powerful tool for the Japanese American community across the Midwest to bring into different spaces and communities to tell the Japanese American story. It's been at exhibitions in Chicago, featured in Wisconsin, now in Indiana, and I'm sure many other states. So I wanted to start off by asking Abby a little bit about why did you make this film and kind of what has happened to the film since it's been made?
So this is one of the rare opportunities I had where somebody actually came to me based on a book. Oh, now I'm going to forget the title of the book, but it was the new book of all of the Dorothea Lange photos. Oh, it'll just come to me. Un-American is what it was called. Okay, and it was done by Rich Cahan and Michael Williams out of Chicago. And somebody who was supporting the book came and said, I think this book needs a DVD. And I said, well, that's not really what I do. But the more I talked about it and the more I understood what was in this book and how much work the authors had done to track down people in the photographs. I mean, this was not easy. Dorothea Lange might have written down, woman at train station, or woman on side of, the street waiting to be, taken to Tanforan or whatever it was. So she did not help us try to find who these people were. And the authors of this book spent several years tracking people down. And the upshot of that is that we had live people who were available to come talk about the situation in the photographs or the situation about their parents or whatever. And once I realized that we were going to be able to do a first person story, and at about the same time Trump decides to announce the Muslim travel ban, I began to be able to see the film. And that's really why I undertook it. Because for me, the question is, am I the right person to do this? Blah, blah, blah. But I think because it had so much of a civil liberties, civil rights aspect to the whole thing, and it was a story that I was personally very attached to, because one of the absolutely first films I ever did was a story for USF Law School. And when they came to me and said, we want you to do a promo film for the law school, I said, I will do it under one circumstance. And that is that you let me talk about and profile the students who went to USF Law School who were part of the Koromatsu reopening case. Mm-hmm. So that was back in the early 80s. And they said, well, okay, if you insist. And I said, I insist. And so from the early 80s on, I, had been working with and knowing about the folks who were involved in that case, some of whom appear in my film. So therefore, a lot of the pieces fell together, and it was a wonderful opportunity to do a deep dive both into the beauty and just compelling nature of Dorothea Lange's photos, as well as the personal stories. I did not know Satsuki Ina. I feel like I've known her my whole life now, but at the time I'd never met her before. And you have to ask Satsuki why she decided to cooperate with me, because that's a whole other thing about, who was I to tell her story or even part of her story. But in the end, it was a very strong collaboration between the filmmaking team and the individuals who were the interviewees. And, our goal was to put together sort of a story that told not only the story back in 1942 and, the incarceration, but kind of the fight that's been going on ever since. And Satsuki and George Takei especially are two of, the people we all need to learn from and look up to. And Koromatsu, I would put the three of them as the leaders, in my mind, of people who I learned from and inspired by, et cetera, as we come to grips with what this means in terms of American history. So that's why I did it. And what's happened, as you say, is that it's had, it's either been an educational tool for people who don't know much about this. So there are plenty of states where there's no education. And when the film shows, people learn a lot. I mean, there's not much education about the Japanese incarceration in Massachusetts. So when this went to Boston and you ask people, well, how many of you were taught anything about this in high school? The answer was nobody. It's better in California, it's better in Chicago. But, even in Chicago, people are just beginning to get educated. So I feel like the film just became a tool in teachers' toolboxes for how to teach about this. And we did a big effort to try to get it into the hands of public high school teachers for free. I raised some money, and I would say we probably distributed, close to 400 copies to teachers who wrote to me and said, can I have a copy? And thanks to a law firm named Fenwick and West, we were able to do that. So that's part of my goal was to get this into the hands of the teachers so that they could use it with their students. So that's who, kind of how the film came about and where it's been.
Yeah, thank you. And I think one of the things the film really does is kind of powerfully bring those static or bring those captures of moments and those pictures into life with all the stories and everything that you integrate. And I wanted to ask Satsuki a little bit about that. So like when I look at Day of Remembrance, I think of my great grandfather who never left camp. I think of my grandmother who was able to leave camp to go to college, and all of we kind of view Day of Remembrance as a time to reflect back on our family legacies like you did in the film. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, now that we're 80 years out on Executive Order 9066, and Day of Remembrances have been happening for I don't know, since 1960 or so, right? Kind of what this Day of Remembrance means to you in this current moment as we look at, the continued child detention and your work with Sudo for Solidarity as well.
Thank you, Eric. Well, Day of Remembrance is, I think all the different Japanese American organizations and communities wanting to make sure that this part of American history is never forgotten. And particularly because in today's climate of division and conflict, how important it is to work in solidarity with other communities, to protest, to speak out, to use our moral authority from having been victims of this incredible injustice, to stand up for communities that are being targeted today. So we organized a group called Sudo for Solidarity, and Sudo is a Japanese word for the origami paper cranes that symbolize peace and hope, and a way to get our community to engage in this process. I think the trauma of our incarceration has kept us from really speaking out and protesting. So we have had incredible support across the country and in Japan and Canada through the paper crane project, where people have folded thousands and thousands of paper cranes for us to take when we are demonstrating, when we are protesting, when we're supporting an initiative to protect targeted communities today.
Yeah, and I also wanted to kind of ask Abby the same question. I know now that it's been a few years since your film has come out, so kind of like reflecting on both, it's been 80 years since Day of Remembrance, and then also kind of how the present moment, or 80 years since Executive Order 9066, sorry, and then also on the current moment of, how the solidarity that you talked about in the film continues to this day, as well as kind of the political moment that you tried to address about 9/11 and everything after that.
Well, I mean, I think I would start with the present and work backwards and say that I found the rise in anti-Asian hate, violence, violent attacks on older people in, Chinatowns across the United States. I found it so personally affecting. It's, I think, sort of maybe because I'd been, kind of living this story, and the idea that we were suddenly kind of re-experiencing, a level of, I don't know, intergroup hostility, and that it was coming out in the way that it was. So I have found the last year plus of what we've seen in terms of AAPI hate crimes appalling. I mean, that's all I want to say. And I feel like education, once again, because, I mean, it's sort of like, I don't know what the antidote to any of this is, but if it isn't about somehow getting to know who people really are and breaking down some stereotypes and some implicit biases, we are screwed as a country. So working kind of backwards, it's like the film was released in 2017, and, then it was like, okay, it's an educational moment. But given what happened in Atlanta, given what happened on the streets of San Francisco, I feel like, there is much more pressure on everybody who sees themselves as any kind of a community educator, to begin to want to say, what is it? How did we get here? And what are we going to do about it? So that was kind of, initially we were dealing with anti-Muslim sentiment, but we were right back smack in the middle of AAPI hate, a year and a half later. So I feel like, I feel called, like I hope other people feel called to, calling this out, working with people who were doing the work to try to stop it. I mean, there were amazing responses in the cities, where young people just said, well, I'll walk the old people to go shopping, and I'll walk people across the street, and I'll try to protect them. I mean, we saw some fantastic community responses, but it was in response to a moment in another moment in American history that I found just horrendous. So I don't, and I don't know where my film fits except to say that it's been sort of out there in the ether. And when, you know, when we do newsletters or whatever, we're sort of calling out the moment that we're in as I feel like a significant moment, and one which, you know, I'm kind of throwing my whole heart into trying to kind of reinterpret where we are. So that's not quite an answer to you, but I just want to say I found the last couple of years pretty tough on this particular issue. Because, you know, part of what you want to believe is that, you know, that we've overcome some of our prejudices. And of course we haven't. I mean, you know, so it's like there's a dialogue going on in the country, but it is misguided to think that we have done all the hard work we need to do, because given what, and you know, and I feel that way about anti-Semitism, and I feel that way about racism in general. It's like, because I feel like I've been working so hard my whole life and helping to develop tools and, you know, participating in groups and having been a civil rights activist my entire life. I'm like, how can we not be further along on this journey than we are? So I don't know quite what to say, except that we have to get up each day and fight the good fight about it. And, you know, and I want to thank you for bringing this film to Indiana, because, you know, every time we can have this discussion outside of, you know, the Bay Area and New York City, it's a good thing for everybody. So I feel like that's not quite responsible, but it's the best I can do.
No, that's great. And I mean, I think, you know, as someone who grew up, who's multiracial and grew up in Indiana, you know, you kind of come to learn about things in, like, you're not necessarily learning about, you're kind of learning about things through osmosis in kind of confusing ways. So I think a resource like this, a film like this, is very beneficial. My mind goes back to, you know, we recently had the Asian American Studies department at IU made a timeline of basically the history of Asian Americans at IU. And, you know, one of the events that really sticks out on that timeline is a Korean international student was tragically murdered by a white supremacist on campus in 1999, which in part led to the creation of the Asian Culture Center on campus and resources for folks today. And then obviously with our, with some of the recent work, we discovered that IU had kind of banned Japanese Americans from campus with some racist attitudes. So I think, you know, that led to, you know, now on campus we have the ACC, which is really a hotbed for essentially employing Asian American students to kind of create activists and engage them in communities. Like that's where I came from, right? That's so there's a ton of us out there, but I do kind of want to ask Satsuki, you know, about kind of when we think about redress and the apology and the check, and IU's apology, and IU, you know, IU didn't put it this way, but they created a reparations scholarship program of $120,000 per year. And, you know, that's a substantial commitment from the school. And, you know, in my work, one of the most powerful ways of telling the Japanese American story is because we have been able to secure these apologies. We kind of have, you know, this evidence that we can hold up and say, you know, America did something wrong, it was unjust, and we can point to something else and say, you know, in solidarity with this group, with Muslim Americans after 9/11, with immigrant children that are detained, you know, we can argue that we see what happened to us in their experience. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you do that and what types of stories you tell about that.
Okay, well, I'm impressed by what IU has been doing. So congratulations on the work and the effort of students, you know, pushing for that kind of response. I think that, you know, apologies and redress is a double-edged sword that sometimes organizations feel like, okay, we say we're sorry, we give people some money, and then we forget about it. And what's important is that there are sustained efforts, organizations, institutions, funding that continues, because if it's not one group, it'll be another group. And one of the things that I've learned as a psychotherapist is that when a country is experiencing mass social anxiety, the common response is to find a scapegoat. And racism often steps forward in blaming some community for the mess we're in, whatever it might be, the war, too many people trying to cross the border, the attack on our country, 9/11. So I think things like Days of Remembrance, programs like you're talking about are really essential to not just be a stopgap measure, but something that really is woven into the fabric of our institutions and our organizations, and particularly have important that our story, the Japanese American story, is part of American history, not just Japanese American history. Absolutely. And that students, young people are inspired and able to understand what could happen to a group of people and be in the present moment when now the anxiety is high in our country. Who will be the next target turned out to be, once again, Asian Americans because of the pandemic. So, then is there a rallying call for solidarity from young people to put a stop to what's happening, a voice that's heard loud and clear, that's grounded in understanding what has happened historically in the US. So I think my sense is that the only way we are really going to address this issue is when we are in solidarity, that we are not working just in the silo of our own communities or our own age group, but working intergenerationally across ethnic communities, across religious organizations, and be able to rely on each other and call on each other when something is starting to simmer up and show up as a scapegoat moment.
Boy, do I second that emotion. Absolutely. I just want to share one other thing. We were talking earlier, and I had to do a little research to find out the answer, because I mentioned Koromatsu's name. And, the work that she has done, she does amazing work in terms of making resources available to teachers, and particularly in the lower grades. But one of the other things she's done to make sure her father's name is not forgotten is she has gotten various states to pass Fred Korematsu Day on January 30th. Mm-hmm. And so there are 6 states, and it's kind of an interesting group of them. So I just want to tell you what they are. It's California, Hawaii, Utah, not a blue state, Illinois, Georgia, and Virginia have all passed official Fred Korematsu days on January 30th. And I know New York City City Council has passed something like that. So that's significant, since not all those states had large Japanese American populations back in the day. So hello. Anyway, kudos. I just wanted to shout out, give Karen a shout out for all the good work she's been doing, as long as I've known her, and then some.
Yeah, of course. I want to ask one last question before we move over to the audience Q&A. So for folks, please get in those questions if you have some on your mind. And I want to ask Abby a little bit about kind of how you balanced this, an outsider with taking these photographs with the Japanese American story, and interviewing, like, there's kind of this weird relationship where, her photographs really capture a lot of the essence of camp, and there's not really another source to go to, right? You have a lot of the stories of the Japanese Americans, and you have the Japanese American photographers, but to some extent, her photos are unique, and you really bring that out in the film. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you, integrate kind of Japanese Americans talking about things that happened to them with kind of an outsider's eyes the outsider's eyes of the photographer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it was complex. So let me say that there was a moment where we had sort of cobbled together. This is, again, I'm like veering sort of a little bit, at a diagonal from what your question was, but I think maybe the audience will find it interesting. there was a moment where we had a cut of the film. And I felt like this is a great cut of the film if what you're teaching is art photography using Dorothea Lange and Ansel Adams. It's not a great story if what you're trying to teach about is the Japanese incarceration. And so we had to really pivot and use Dorothea Lange's photos as either a jumping off place, like for Satsuki to tell her mother's story, we use the image that Dorothea Lange happened to shoot of her mother. Dorothea Lange didn't know she was shooting her mother. You know what I mean? Dorothea Lange takes this picture of this woman who's sort of standing out of line while she's waiting to get her ID. But from that, we are able to, because we get to meet Satsuki, she becomes available to me after she vetted me and decided I was okay and she would be willing to be interviewed by me, which is sort of the point. And then, and so we sort of are slowly weaving this, and when Satsuki, it took her a while to trust me enough to give me some more material, which we got from her about, her dad was incarcerated. They're all incarcerated in Tule Lake, and he's super incarcerated, for having signed those two questions, by answering those questions, no. So it's like those stories build as you get to know your subjects. So that's sort of one piece of the story. Then I felt like the film lacked a kind of coherence, so it's like I'm building this thing and it's sort of in pieces and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to put the whole thing together. And I have the flash of, if I can get George Takei into this film, it is going to provide some of the glue that I need. But getting him is a much more complicated proposition than just sort of making a phone call or finding his email. And so that took time. I mean, they said, no, we're way too busy. And I don't even remember what I finally did. I finally got up the nerve to call his husband, his partner is his agent, essentially. And I had to convince, and this guy, his job is to say no to everybody, because otherwise George would never have 5 seconds to himself. But I pushed him and I said, I think in the end, George is going to want to be in this film. That this is a film that's sort of consistent with, his politics and his point of view. And I need him. And at some point, the guy said, okay, you get an hour, come over. And George, the reason he needs his husband/agent is because George would have talked to me for 3 hours. But at the end of an hour, I'm basically kicked out the door. And that was okay, because we got what we needed. George was very helpful. And as I say, I think provided some of the glue. The thing that George offers, so that he doesn't feel like an outsider at all, is even though he was a child at the time, he tells the story in the present tense. And so you feel like you are with him as those army officers are walking up to the front door of his house. And he was like, 3 or 4 years old at the time. But he has told the story enough and he has embedded himself in the story enough that he's a very unique storyteller. And so to that extent, I really felt like I needed him, because for everybody else, there was also an outsider feel. I mean, we're talking to the children who didn't experience the pain that their parents experienced. And even though today they're older than their parents were when they were incarcerated, there's a disconnect. And so George, in his own way as a storyteller, bridges that gap for me in the film, and I think for many people who get to listen to him in other presentations and so on. So I felt like, I brought my storytelling skills as a filmmaker to try to figure out how to craft this thing in a way that people would want to watch it. And it became less about the outsider, either Dorothea or me. And it became much more about how do we embed ourselves in this story in a way that people are going to feel it. And I think, quite frankly, I think George and Satsuki sort of saved the film, because the other people who I interviewed were actually, they didn't want to be interviewed. They really had to be pushed. And once they were there, they didn't really tell stories. They just answered, little bits and pieces of my questions. So you need people who can kind of weave more of a story. And in both Satsuki and George, I had them. And that enabled us to sort of figure it out. And one last thing I want to say, which is because of what I told you earlier about my connection to the Koromatsu case, there was no way this film was going to be made without the Koromatsu case being in it. Because for me, it was such an important moment of resistance at the time. I mean, I feel like, I honor Fred anytime I possibly can for what he did. And the fact that I had access to his daughter was helpful. But I just have always felt that, that George standing up for himself and for Japanese Americans at the time is something we all need to know and we need to honor as we move forward.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to Jessica to give some questions from the audience.
Yes, we've been receiving really great and thoughtful questions. If you have one, there's still time to submit a question. You can do so by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and then just type your question into the Q&A box. Our first question is from Lisa, who I think is prompting a story. The explanation by Abby of the origins of the film reminds me of what recently happened with the Dorothea Lange photo of Dr. Ina's mother. Dr. Ina, would you be willing to talk about the process of getting your mother's name added to the record of this photo and what it means to you?
Good story. Yeah, that's it.
It is what I was thinking about as Abby was speaking. And did you say the person who's asking the question is a student there?
Let me see. I'm not sure, actually.
Lisa's a PhD student, yes.
Okay, good.
Okay. A complicated story, but I'll simplify. One of the things that has been missing from the Dorothea Lange story is the reality that she took these photos observing people in a state of trauma and never asked their names or included their names in the publication of or reproduction of the photos that she took. So my mother's photo has been used in many venues in books and museums and exhibits, but it's always as an anonymous person. So the Library of Congress contacted me and was wanting permission to, I'm not sure exactly what the permission was, but to include that photo in their collection. My son, Adrian Tomine, had also done a graphic representation of that same photo, and they wanted to have both the illustration my son did and the Dorothea Lange photo. And I responded by saying that I think that's wonderful. And one of the things that would be such a repair of the anonymity that was imposed on the subjects of these amazing photos is I want my mother's name included in the archiving of Dorothea Lange's photo. And so the woman that I spoke with and worked with saw that as an important element. And so now it is in the Library of Congress with her name, Shizuko Mitsui Ina, along with my son's drawing of that photo.
I just want to give a shout out to her son, who happens to be one of the people whose work you see on the cover of the New Yorker periodically. So her son is an accomplished graphic artist, just saying.
The next question is from Teresa, who asks, could you please discuss why the Supreme Court has not reversed the Koromatsu ruling?
Because they're dishonest suckers. I mean, I mean, come on. They say they actually claim that they have, but they haven't.
Yeah.
And so and get ready for them to say they're not overruling Roe versus Wade when they do. So we are just in a moment of, dishonesty from the court. So it's more outrageous in a way that they said they did overrule it. I can't even remember. It was in one of the Muslim travel ban cases, but they didn't because they upheld all the restrictions. So the fact is, they claim they've overruled it. They haven't, and it remains kind of this shadow moment in I don't know, judicial history and the history of American, law and jurisprudence. And it's one that's another reason I feel like we need to know about it, because here's one of the key things that I feel like we do in the film, and it becomes important, is that in order for the Koromatsu case to have come out the way it did back in 1944, it was based on lies back then. Mm-hmm. So the fact that, that what the Koromatsu Coram Nobis case does is it reopens it and says, okay, here were all the lies and here's the proof that this thing was all based on lies. But there was no way to take that back up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So we end up with a district court. So we have three levels. There's district, Circuit Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. We have a great district court ruling that actually addresses all these issues. And the Supreme Court, in one sentence says, well, today we overrule Koromatsu. However, here are the 72 reasons why the Muslim travel ban is still legitimate. So the answer is they claim they did. They didn't. Why didn't they? Because it is this Supreme Court. That's all I can say. Okay, let's take another question.
All right, we can take another. We've got lots. Kathy asks for Satsuki. We heard about prejudice after release and then finally, eventually reparation checks. But could you say more about how people rebuilt their lives after the camps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's certainly not just one story about how people rebuilt their lives, because there were many who were not able to rebuild their lives. There was a significantly high rate of suicide post-prison camp because there were people upon release who had nowhere to go, had lost their land, their jobs, missed out on the opportunities to get educated. So there was, we hear the stories of people who survived and managed today. Many of the stories that we don't know all the details about are the people who fell into despair and actually never really recovered. So, my parents rebuilt their lives, but they could have had a better life if they hadn't been incarcerated. So they, because of circumstances where they answered no to the loyalty questionnaire, felt there was no hope for them in this country, they renounced their American citizenship under duress, and thought that if they were sent back to Japan, that the children, me and my brother, would have a better chance for a life there. But as a result, they ended up staying in the US without citizenship until 1959. And so during those years, they were released in 1946, and not until 1959 did they get their citizenship. They were living under the radar. They were living on hold. They couldn't buy a house. They couldn't vote. So they rebuilt their lives because they worked hard. They did a lot of physical labor, working hard not to rock the boat for their children. So I think my generation and generations after have been building back what they couldn't have in their own lifetime. So, people lost a lifetime of earnings, of property, of career that they could never regain again. And $20,000 redress was symbolic redress and reparations. It didn't really answer the problem. Like, my parents were incarcerated for 4.5 years. And $20,000 certainly didn't fix anything. I mean, by that time, my father had already passed away. So I think it's important to recognize that the American government provided redress and responded to the injustice that had taken place. But we don't want to forget that there's some things that can't be repaired from that kind of horrific prejudice and discrimination.
And I want to say I want to say two things that I've learned in the course of knowing Satsuki. One thing is that, and this is something actually from other, kind of other work that I've done with people going out with this film. So somebody said, how come there's so many lawyers and doctors in the next generation of Japanese American children? And that had a lot to do with people really, focusing on education. But there's another, it's not like another story, but the issue of, staying out of trouble. There was a big message that Satsuki's parents' generation gave to the next generation about, there was a way in which people were, as Satsuki said, traumatized so badly by this, that the notion that if you spoke out and were, I don't know, a radical, an activist or whatever, a free speech movement person in the mid 1960s, they were terrified that their children were going to go to jail again, like they had been incarcerated. So there was a way in which there was intergenerational pressure that was a result of the incarceration that I want Satsuki to say more about, that affected her and her generation. Because it's a huge group of people who had to find their way through the messages that their parents had given them based on what their parents had been through. So I don't know, Satsuki, say something else about it, because it was.
Well, I'll say this, is that in my generation, George Takei is a unique example of someone who was able to choose the arts as a profession. Right. So much pressure was on us to secure safety for our parents after post-war. We became engineers and
doctors and lawyers.
Yeah, doctors and lawyers. And we lost the creativity, musical creativity, performance artists, because in my community, those were not options that were available. Those were not going to create the kind of security that they needed their children to create for them and for their future. So there's a huge loss in that. There were so many people who had to opt out of their natural inclination to be creative and artistic, to be practical and have status that could possibly protect them from another imposition of injustice.
Yeah.
So I'm proud that my sons, fourth generation, are both artists.
Yeah.
And they've been able to be quite successful. And it took that many generations before they could be free to really be who they were meant to be.
And I have many Asian American friends who play music as an avocation. I mean, they're all in all kinds of bands, but they're all lawyers. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, that's how they kind of worked it out.
Yeah.
All right. You got another question for us?
Yep. So Hannah asks a question about, we saw a lot about how the government was using a lot of euphemisms and how they were trying to keep control of the narrative. Was there any extent to which people outside the internment camps understood those conditions? And was there any sympathy for Japanese Americans in a broad sense?
Okay, I want to say this as a self-criticism of my film. If I had to redo the film, or if I was going to add to it, I would find a way to there are two things that are relevant. One is that Dorothea Lange and her husband were two of the most supportive people in the country of Japanese Americans. They understood what was happening. This is sort of after Dorothea was doing her photography. Number one, she couldn't continue with her photography because she actually developed like a stomach ulcer and became too ill to proceed. She actually had a somatic reaction to what she was seeing. And Satsuki's right when she says, she didn't know who she was photographing, and she didn't, she was up on some platform somewhere trying to take the photographs and didn't have an assistant who could go find out who she had just photographed. I mean, not to excuse it, it's just to say that's kind of what was happening. But Dorothea got sick early on. And so actually most of her pictures are not of camp. They're actually of people being rounded up. So it's in the early days. Her pictures are sort of 42 to 43. And that's just a fact about her. But she and her husband were really supportive of Japanese Americans, had friends who were Japanese American. They lived in Berkeley, and, they played a role. There are not many, but there are people who deserve credit for what they did for their neighbors. There are people in Fresno who saved their neighbors' farms until they came back. Again, most people's property was sold out from under them, and there was no opportunity for a neighbor to be helpful. But there were some upstanders, we might call them, in the white community who, who were friends with their Japanese American neighbors and actually tried hard to save whatever property they observed or was near them or whatever, or houses. I mean, so there were upstanders. It just, the numbers were tiny in comparison to the people who couldn't wait to purchase or do a fire sale or whatever on the rest of it. I mean, I think the point is that in every situation like this, there are a few people who see the truth, understand the truth, and speak up for the truth. I mean, there were teachers of kids who were taken to camps who came and visited and brought them supplies. It's like, not everybody colluded with the United States government on this, but those examples are few, and I should have done a better job of shining some light on that. I feel like that's the missing piece in my film. So I just want to say that self-critically.
Well, and everybody out there knows now.
Yeah, well,
everybody within the sound of your voice. We only have time for a few more questions, but Kathy would like to know, do you have any idea how benchmarks like 1/16 are decided upon when governments are looking to recognize and police identity? That seems to say that someone could be incarcerated if one of their 16 great-great-grandparents was from Japan and they were a third-generation American citizen.
I think it reflects the ability to capture everybody who was of Japanese blood, because it goes back to the first immigrants that ever came to the US from Japan. So, it enabled them to remove children who were in orphanages, who were half Japanese and a quarter Japanese. They were removed because they were a threat to national security. And so they rounded them up from the Southern California and in San Francisco Bay Area, removed from orphanages and foster care and placed in Manzanar in prison, inside of a prison orphanage.
Yeah.
There are so many examples of why that idea that this was for national security, the fact that innocent children who were in foster care and orphanages were removed just because of the blood count. So it was, I think, particularly comprehensive. It was a way to get everybody on the West Coast that had Japanese blood. Yeah.
And then our final question, but it's a big one. It comes from Sarah specifically, but there are a lot of people in our comments and our Q&As who are expressing a lot of anger, helplessness, frustration, as I'm sure we all feel learning this story. So the question is kind of twofold. First, are there any other efforts or lobbying groups that are trying to get this history taught in more schools across the nation? And then as an extension of that, I'd like to say, what would you say to those of us who are listening? What can we do? What should we do? How can we be part of the solution instead of
I want Satsuki to answer that in part. I want Satsuki to talk about the work that they did in Texas during the child separation policy that we just came out of and actually are still sort of in. Satsuki, talk about what Sudo for Solidarity did. I mean, it was a very activist response led by Japanese Americans who said, we're not going to let this happen to another community on our shores. But sure. Talk about that a little bit, because it was very motivational.
Part of our trauma was to be silenced and to not rock the boat, to not bring attention to ourselves. And so my generation of children who were in the camps grew up towing the line. Not becoming artists, but jaywalking, and anything that would, bring attention to you as a potential risk to national security. So protest has not been a strong suit for people in the Japanese American community who were my generation. And the effort that went into redress and reparations was the beginning of, a whole nother generation who were demanding that the government recognize and acknowledge what they did wrong to the Japanese Americans. So there were, a group of us who had been incarcerated at Crystal City, Texas, had organized a pilgrimage, and 40 miles from the place where we had been held as children was a what they called a family residential center, which held several hundred Central American women with their babies and children, and being held indefinitely as they were seeking asylum. And so, we're in our 70s, 80s, and 90s. And after the pilgrimage, we decided that we would go to that facility, and which was a prison. We contacted press. We showed up to share our story and talk about why we were protesting the repetition of our history. And so in doing that, there was actually a healing for us, a time where we felt so outraged that our history was being repeated again, and found that by speaking out on behalf of the recently targeted group, that we were strong in numbers, that we were releasing our outrage and finding a way to educate people about what happened to us with a purpose in the immediate current day life. What people can do, when we were removed, there were no protests, there were no marches, there were no petitions. There were certainly, like Abby said, individuals, and a few government officials. But otherwise, I would say that as children were being disappeared from the classrooms, fellow workers were not showing up to work anymore. Houses were empty. Farms were left behind. America essentially turned their backs on us, and there was a deafening silence. And so I think that speaking out, relating what's happening today to the historical repetition of history is really important to get informed. And I think there are many organizations today, like Sudo for Solidarity, that people are welcome to join to participate in learning about legislation that needs to be challenged, or promoting a legislation that needs to be passed, and working in solidarity, letting people know who are being targeted that somebody outside cares.
I just have to add one thing. I gotta say, there's an article in Time magazine. So this is another upstander. Another upstander who should have been in my film was Eleanor Roosevelt. Oh. She pushed within the administration and tried to get her husband not to sign the executive order. So I just want to say, read in Time magazine today. You can kind of learn a little bit about Eleanor Roosevelt and the role she attempted, not successfully, obviously, to play in calming the hysteria that was overtaking Washington after Pearl Harbor. And so anyway, she says, this is what she said. She said, this crisis was a time for, quote, really believing in the Bill of Rights and making it a reality for all loyal American citizens, regardless of race. Well, kudos to her for having seen it for what it was. But I just, as we're calling out upstanders, I keep forgetting poor Eleanor Roosevelt. So
I'd like to just add one thing too, is that for students who are listening, it may seem overwhelming, like, what can I do? Well, one thing you can do is to learn the history and use the right language. So much of our narrative was written by the US government and the War Relocation Authority. And there are euphemistic language that minimizes what was done to us and what the impact was. And so, challenge teachers, others who misuse the language. We were arrested.
They were not interned. They were incarcerated.
We were not interned. We were incarcerated. We were not in relocation centers. We were placed in prisons. We suffered the torture of indeterminate sentencing. There was violence perpetrated against people who were held inside the barbed wire fence. was not for our own protection because the guns were pointed inward. So anytime you as a student can say, you know, I want to correct your version of what happened, that is something you can do that would make a difference.
Absolutely, yes. And let me say, you know, we have a little bit of it in the film, but there's more, many more words that need to be reclaimed and reconfigured.
That wraps it up for us. Do Abby or Satsuki, do either of you have anything you'd like to say to end things?
I just wanted to share how you can get this film, because if you saw, you know, it was available through IU Cinema, but it is actually available really for a few dollars through something called Vimeo on Demand. And so if any of you who are still with us want to refer family, friends, colleagues, other students, etc., you literally put Vimeo on Demand plus, and then they came for us and into Google, and it will come up and you will see how you can watch it, share it, experience it yourself. So, you know, or with others. So I just want people to know that this film is available.
And so this Q&A will also be available on YouTube, the IU Cinema YouTube channel. So actually anyone else could experience kind of this whole thing.
Can someone type into the chat the Vimeo that link?
The thing I just said?
Yeah.
Okay, you're going to give me a second. Don't go away. Don't end this thing until I get, because I don't, you know, it's going to take me a second to do it.
Yeah.
So Satsuki, give them some last words while I try to find you.
Well, I just want to thank you. I'm so grateful to be able to speak to students at IU, and really appreciate Eric and everybody's effort to make this happen. This is the avenue for change, when we educate each other, when we get to know each other, share personal stories. I think it's a powerful opportunity. And I love sharing this platform with Abby.
And I love sharing it with Satsuki.
Because when Abby came to talk to me about making this film, you know, I'm always suspicious of somebody who hasn't been part of the experience, who may be appropriating our story. So I was very reluctant when I first met with Abby. And then every day from that moment on, she convinced me that she was, in fact, the most powerful kind of ally a person could have. And people in our community love and admire and respect her. And I just feel like our partnership is a really good example of how solidarity can make a difference in our historical accounting of what happened. So,
yes,
so thank you very much.
I want to say back at Satsuki, it has been one of the honors of my life to collaborate with her on this. And so we pretty much are joined at the hip.
Yeah.
You know? When the film is invited to be shown and they're like, okay, who are the speakers going to be? It's usually the two of us. So you got the full package here at IU today. And let me say, I put it in the chat, but I don't know where Ava went, because it has to go to everybody, because I could only send it to the host.
It's Ava sent it out to everybody. So everybody in your
good.
chat box should receive.
All right, so it's
way.
easy. It's Vimeo on Demand, and then they came for us. That's sort of it. Okay. But it's available, and we encourage people to, you know, share it. I mean, that's really what we want you to do. And it's like, I guess one last thing I would say is that, just like Satsuki said, you can call out the misrepresentation of the language. You know, you can become a spokesperson for better education at the high school level, or even at the junior high school level. I mean, I know I wasn't taught this story. I grew up in the Manhattan public schools, and, you know, this was not part of what I learned when I was in elementary or junior high school or high school. And so, you know, and you can be an activist against AAPI hate. I mean, there's a lot of room for us these days, because there's so much that's going wrong in this country. So I want to give a kind of general shout out for pick your subject and be an activist. And whether it is climate change or reproductive rights or, you know, racial equality or defending affirmative action, which we're going to have to do because that's about to just go right down the tubes. You know, imagine a situation in which a university would not be allowed to put $120,000 into a scholarship fund, you know, because somehow it dishonors the white experience or some crap like that. You know, we need to fight for, I mean, we're still in a moment of needing to repair damage.
Yeah.
So it is way too early to start acting as if everything's okay and we're all on a level playing field. So to the students who are with us and to graduate students and so on, Satsuki and I have a message, which is, get out there and get your shoe leather going on the ground if you have to about the issues that matter to you. And in my lifetime, and I am an old person, I have never seen such an attack on books being dumped out of libraries, teachers being told what they can teach. I mean, we are actually in a scary moment.
Yeah.
And so for all of you who are involved in education, either as a student or as a potential teacher down the road, we have a lot of work to do to create a kind of sphere of freedom around the schools and around what professors teach and so on. Or, no one's going to want to be part of a new education system in which we're all told what we have to teach and what we have to think. So this is a moment for activism because it's such a scary time in this country. So just saying,
No, absolutely. And that was the question.
Get those sneakers ready to march.
All right. Well, with that call for action, thank you, Satsuki, Abby, Eric, Caitlin, and again, all of you in the audience for being with us. I'd like to thank the entire IU Cinema team, and particularly Brittany, Seth, David, Max, and Ava, who have all worked behind the scenes to help make this event possible. We'd like to encourage you to go to our website at cinema.indiana.edu to see all of our upcoming films and events. To all of you who tuned in, thank you once again for being with us. Please be kind and be generous to yourselves and to others, and we will hope to see you again soon. Thank you all so much, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great to be here.